Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the brand new Tome system coming in with the next DBD mid-chapter, and the implications it has on this game's wider approach to storytelling. A new mid-chapter has landed, and after a controversial PTB period, the Tools and Torment mid-chapter looks like the biggest meta shake-up in the game's history. Most general aggression perks are all but dead in the water, medkits have been nerfed at long fucking last. Circle of Healing is beaten to death with a rock, and all of this means twins are back on the menu, boys. But while Billy mains and healing enthusiasts are rejoicing about behaviour's positive reception to community feedback this patch, there is one change that's still happening in this mid-chapter that I think is a big mistake. And not only was it always going to be in this mid-chapter, but there's basically no hope in changing it in the short term. It's coming, and it'll be here for a while, if not forever. The Tome system is changing, and there's two components to that change. The first being that the Deep Rift cosmetics are going to be made more visually distinct from the cosmetics in the regular Rift track, which I guess is, fine, but since we haven't seen what those changes are going to be, the proof of the pudding I guess will be in the unlocking. But the big change was a lead that behaviour elegantly buried at the bottom of the dev update. Going forwards, all original new characters will receive Tome stories the mid-chapter after their release. This applied to the Knight and Vittorio, it will apply to Skull Merchant and the Lyra siblings, and it will apply to all future original chapters. When a licensed chapter comes out, they may get a Tome, but odds are they won't, and it'll instead feature existing original characters. The update also notes that older characters were involved in the Tomes as well as minor characters, but in terms of the actual meaning of that phrase, we don't know. Most of this video is going to be talking about the implications that new characters getting Tomes immediately is liable to have on the quality of the stories, but before I do, I want to talk briefly about these older characters. Survivors and killers who haven't received Tomes yet, and who many of us expected would get starring roles in upcoming future Tomes. 4 original killers are as of yet unaccounted for in Tomes: Oni, Deathslinger, Artis and Dredge, while 7 survivors are also missing Tomes: Feng Min, Adam, Jeff, Zarina, Felix, Elodie and Hattie. These characters were leading candidates to get the next Tome stories, but with the announcement this dream is pretty much crushed, at least as far as we're aware. Needless to say, this is pretty disappointing. Feng Min and Oni especially have been waiting a very long time for Tomes, and this is any indication they're going to be waiting a hell of a lot longer. How long that may be depends on the definition behaviour has of minor character, because this could mean that the new Tomes have extra stories in them for older characters, kind of like the Tomes between 2 and 6 that had 3 or 4 characters instead of 2. However, there is a pretty high chance that when behaviour says minor characters, it means older characters getting cosmetics in the Rift Pass and saving their stories until licensed chapters. That would mean we wouldn't get through our 4 killer backlog for 2.5 to 3 years. I wouldn't get through all the survivors until at least 2028, 5 years from now. I'm sorry, I'm not ready to wait until I'm almost in my 30s for a Hattie Tome to come out, and I think that's unreasonable to expect a story for an existing important character in good time. To say nothing of the chance of going back to give original characters second Tomes to further flesh them out. This has only ever happened once before to be fair, but it made David a significantly more interesting and compelling character, and it would be a massive shame if a dogmatic adherence to a new story policy took that possibility off limits. Fortunately, it's something that behaviour at least seems aware of. Comments by lead community manager Death by Giggles assert that they're at least aware of concerns around older characters getting Tomes, and this is likely to be addressed at some stage. So, in a very dangerous turn of phrase, let's give behaviour the benefit of the doubt, and assume that the minor character disclosure or whatever means these forgotten few will get stories of their own in the Tomes in good time, and we're waiting until the heat death of the universe to finally read a story about Jeff and his little dog. Even assuming the best for all the old characters in potential second Tomes, I still think this change is an absolute disaster for intelligent storytelling, and I'm going to tell you why. But before we continue, I want to introduce you to today's partner, ExpressVPN. As the threat of DDoS attacks against Dead by Daylight players continues to rear its ugly head, it's never been a better time to invest in a VPN to protect yourself and your data from attackers. ExpressVPN puts your browsing data through their servers, leaving you safely encrypted and free to browse the web from any of their server locations. This not only protects your data from government or corporate surveillance, but allows you to access region-locked content from anywhere in the world. I like to use it to read regional news articles and things like that, but it's just as handy for streaming services too. ExpressVPN are here with an exciting new deal so you can get in on the action. Sign up now for ExpressVPN and get 3 months free using the link in the description and in the pinned comment. Now, back to the video. To demonstrate the issue I have with the new Tome system, I want to illustrate to you exactly what makes a truly good Tome story, to show you how a Tome released immediately after a killer or survivor might struggle to be there. And showcase a good Tome story, I want to look at the hillbilly story A Man Named Boy that came out in Tome 5. As one of the 3 OG killers, Billy's original story was extremely underdeveloped. It set up who Billy was, an abused child who got revenge on his tormentors, but didn't really do anything else at all. It got people on Billy's side emotionally because we naturally feel sympathy for abuse victims, but it didn't tell us much about the way he thinks and feels. Like, how conscious is he of what's happening to him? Does he have communication issues that alienate him from his family? What even did he escape with, and what made him do so now rather than before? These are all questions that we sat with for years before A Man Named Boy answered all of them, with amazing attention to detail and sensitivity towards Max's imprisonment and abuse at his parents' hands. Max's story turned out amazing because it addressed everything we didn't know about the killer and filled in gaps that had occurred naturally in the story over time. No one bio can ever be fully complete, no matter how long it is, and A Man Named Boy fleshed out a character who just hadn't aged well up until that point. Crucially, it could only do this because Billy's lore was so old, and there was a significant gap between the base lore and the Tome being written. We as readers on the Behaviour's writing team had years to understand this story and the holes in it, to get a sense of what worked and what needed to be expanded in a Tome. This isn't something that's easy to figure out. It takes time for the DBD community, especially those of us vested in the lore like me, to really get to know a character and figure out what we're missing or what needs fleshing out. The best Tomes work with the existing perception of the character and do something interesting with it. A new spin to create a more stereoscopic view of that character and their relationships. Talbot is presented as an emotionally detached mad scientist who gives into an alternate persona as the Blight. The human quotient Tome story comes in to alter that perception, making him more conscientious and even giving him a love interest. Adiris is presented as a potentially egotistical or vain figure in her refusal to accept what happens to her. Turn that on its head in the Maiden Guard by giving her someone to look up to in her barn and explore how that unbreakable faith first came about. They have to both subvert the way the character was originally presented to give us something new to work with, and give us some consistency that lets us know that it's still the same character that we knew and loved from the beginning. This causes an issue with making a Tome for brand new characters on their release, because these stories will be written at the same time as the base lore, or very, very close to it. Meaning nobody knows what elements of the character work or not. The writers are going in blind, and that reduces the chances of that story coming out the other side actually being worthwhile and answering the questions it needs to answer. Let's look for an example here as a character whose base lore is widely considered to have missed the mark, and could do with a touch-up in a Tome. There's a placeholder image on screen to represent such a character. Instead of relying on community feedback and reception of the character to inform the way the story is written, Behaviour's writers are instead going in more or less blind, relying on guesswork and their own judgment to decide what course the story should take. The same judgment that led to the mediocre story in the first place. You see the problem here? Even if Skull Merchant's new Tome coming up does do the miracle work and fixes her lore problem that Trickster's Tome did, a dangerous precedent is still set for how future character stories get treated, because if that happens, suddenly it becomes okay to half-ass the stories of new characters because you can just fix it in the Tome that comes later and it'll all be fine. If I was being really cynical, I'd even say that stories like hers that have obvious gaping holes in them may even be written this way intentionally to give the character something to immediately write a Tome about. Not to mention, if the Tome story turns out bad, you've just burned your one shot to make this character's lore not a shitfest, because you went in too early and wrote the story without receiving any feedback. If the story's bad, it's a waste of time, and if the story's good, why wasn't this improvement in the base lore to begin with? However you cut it, it's just not fair on the people who like these new characters to only give us half a story when the full one's already been written and has been split up into a Tome. Just give us the whole character straight up and develop them further in a Tome later, Whether Skull Merchant's new tome is good or not is barely relevant, because whatever happens, it sets a bad precedent for future stories to follow and will result in the cheapening of this game's lore and storytelling. I don't know about you, but I'm not taking that line down. You might think I'm scaremongering or whatever, but there's no speculation to be had here. This has already happened because the Forged in Fog tome has demonstrated what I mean perfectly. Knight and Vittorio both had elements missing from their base stories. Knight didn't have a developed relationship with his comrades in arms, despite them being a massive part of his identity overall. And Vittorio left a big gap in his lore between his departure from Port Oscuro, where he looked like a medieval lord, and his appearance in the Entity's realm, where he looked like a Dilfia John Bon Jovi. The tome they got immediately after their release didn't really help either of these issues, and as a result it made the stories way less interesting. Tardosh's story was right, I guess. It was fun to read, but didn't really expand his character or relationships whatsoever. And Vittorio's was totally expected, finishing his story by filling in the blanks from his base lore in the most colouring by numbers way possible, but did nothing interesting with it whatsoever. That's actually why I haven't covered Vittorio's tome in a video yet, because there's nothing of interest in there at all. Both of these stories were defined by not doing anything exciting, because the characters in question were so new, the writers were still getting to grips with them, and it made the tome pretty forgettable. And what's worse is, if you were not someone who particularly enjoyed these characters, having the tome following their release also being about them alienates a lot of players because of nothing but Forged in Fog content for 3 months straight. Normally the mid-chapter tome can be a breather for people like me who feel kind of mediocre on a character's release sometimes, and reading a story about an old character that you might actually like is a breath of fresh air to keep things interesting. For original characters going forwards, that's never going to happen again. Meaning if you have a character who wasn't received very well and has a niche following, a second story for them immediately is just going to fatigue people even more, regardless of if the story is even good or not. Not only do the odds of improving characters who need a story touch-up go down when a tome for them is written immediately, the very existence of that immediate tome story risks alienating and boring people who don't find the new content appealing. That's a problem that DBD already has during the 3-month break between new chapters, and it's only going to get worse if that means even more killer challenges, skins and stories in new tome releases for these brand new characters. I don't see a reason why this change should be done from an artistic standpoint. Almost objectively, the stories are going to be worse from the writers having less time and feedback to work on them, and it'll exhaust players who don't care for the new content on top of that. It's just perplexing because I don't see what the appeal of this is. Well, actually I kind of do, and I hate to say it, but it's money. By making it clear that all original characters will be in rifts and tomes after their release, Behaviour is saying to players, buy our original chapter and do it quickly. To do the challenges, you'll need the survivors and killers, you'll need the perks, so you may as well get them now, so by the time it comes out you can grind the stuff you need to complete the rift. Pushing these rifts and therefore the stories that come with them up in urgency pushes players to buy these chapters quickly, potentially trading quality for a fear of missing out. And that's so disappointing because it almost inevitably makes the quality of the stories at the end worse. To be fair, I can see why they're doing it. Big licenses like the RE release make big bucks. And I'll bet you in recent years, original chapters haven't been making the same kinds of money they used to. I'm discounting the last 2 chapters because they're too new to influence this decision, but looking at the last couple of years of original releases, the only ones I can imagine selling really well were Descend Beyond, All Kill, and maybe Hour of the Witch. Roots of Dread, Binding of Kin, Portrait of a Murder, these chapters probably didn't sell very well, signalling to the higher-ups at Behaviour that original chapters need to sell better. Something that poor receptions to Forged in Fog and Tools of Torment probably back up. One of the ways they're doing this is by changing the tomes to keep these new chapters more relevant for longer. This is a smart decision from a business perspective, but it comes from an accidental or possibly purposeful disdain and disregard for the quality of these chapters' stories, and that makes me a very sad boy. The Forged in Fog tome stories have shown me what the future of DBD's original story content looks like. Writers staggering around in the dark, trying to expand characters that haven't really settled down yet. Trying to second guess feedback before it can come, and working to a tighter deadline than normal. Look, I can't pretend this isn't going to make Behaviour more money from these rifts. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. and that makes changing it a very hard sell, especially understanding how far in advance tomes are planned out. The next 2 or 3 tomes are probably already drawn up. Which characters are included, what skins they're getting, maybe even the stories themselves. So I'm not going to suggest scrapping this policy altogether because it just isn't going to happen. They've already committed, the ink has dried, and by the time we could have said something about it, it's already too late. But there is one thing they could do that's a pretty low opportunity cost for behaviour and would almost completely resolve the issues of an instant release tome model, like the neglect of older characters, the writing issues that come with instant tomes, and content fatigue introduced by 3-sided months of the same characters. I think some of the extra money behaviour's making from the original chapters and rifts should be put to use expanding the number of stories in a tome release from 2 to 3. I suggest alongside the new original Survivor and Killer, a 3rd tome story should be written for every mid-chapter going forwards, either for an older character who hasn't had a tome story yet, or a 2nd tome story for a character who may have already had one. Call it a legacy story if you like. A bone to throw for appreciators of old and underloved characters who don't get very much to play with very often, or a character who got shitty stories before who is maybe due a second look. 1 extra story every 3 months. How hard would that be? You guys used to do 4 before, winding back to 2 in Tome 6. 3 isn't unreasonable given how well behaviour's been doing lately. You can absolutely afford it. The relief of even 1 survivor or killer getting a story alongside the new guys would be immense. Doesn't mean giving them new skins of the rest if you don't want to do that, although you could. But all we need is another story to help keep us occupied, and it solves the problem of new characters potentially getting undercooked stories too. If the new story for Skull Merchant or Talita or whoever on release is missing something, you can just wait a year and put them in the legacy slot in a later tome, because your release schedule has enough flexibility now to let you experiment, and revisit characters you've already looked at. In general, I'd love to see greater emphasis on old characters getting 2nd tomes in this slot, because between the legacy slot and the licensed chapters there'd be a lot of room to revisit old characters at that point. Imagine for example if we got a Cursed Legacy style sequel chapter 2 of Flesh and Mud, with the hag's grandmother as a survivor and one of the cannibals who kidnapped her as a killer. You could throw in a hag story in the legacy slot to tie it all together. Or a licensed release let us get a Dredge and Haddie tome, and the legacy slot went to the Doctor, to give us more backstory on Otto's Stamper. So maybe we can see Otto go from the cult leader he was in the Dredge's story to Herman's deranged mentor at the Institute. There's so much we could achieve if behaviour added a legacy tome slot and story to each new tome release, and yes, it would require more work from behaviour, but if they're asking more from us, more money to complete the rifts each time by pushing us to buy each new chapter to complete them, they need to give something back to us, and if this decision is going to make the stories we do get worse, the least we can do is expect some sort of recompense. You gotta spend money to make money, and retaining the interest of hardcore lore whores like me and the people watching this video probably is worth that investment. 1 bonus story every 3 months, how hard could that be? It's such a minor request for what could be a truly excellent, refreshing addition to the tome model that suits the concerns of players whose characters may not be due for a tome for years otherwise. I don't think that's too much to ask, do you? So that's everything I had to say for now about the new tome story system. What do you reckon? Are you excited? Are you concerned? Do you think I'm being overly worried? Whatever you have to say, let me know in the comments. I do love a discussion, I read every single one, so yeah. Haven't uploaded for a little bit because I've recently been away saying goodbye to my family dog that recently passed on. Thanks for bearing with me in my recent downtime, but I am back with a vengeance and I've got a lot to do before April ends. Between the new tome lore, the likely reveal of a new licensed chapter this month, and a biggie with that update coming, there's a lot on my plate, so if you don't want to miss it, then do subscribe to the channel. If you really like me, consider supporting me on Patreon. My patrons get early access to all my videos plus some other sweet perks, so if you're ever interested in supporting the channel, the link is in the description. Also down there is a link to ExpressVPN, sponsors of today's video and absolute heroes. You can take back your internet privacy today by looking at the link in the description to get 3 months free from ExpressVPN. And on that note, I'll see you in the next one, so ta-ta for now.